So I mean, it looks as though Trump is probably going to have the votes, I would think,
Yeah.
because I don't think he would nominate someone without knowing exactly whether or not he had the votes. And so I think we can expect that whoever Trump does go through with is more than likely going to get
Mhm.
confirmed. Am I right about that?
Yeah, especially since they can't filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Reid got rid of the filibuster for judicial appointments several years ago, and to be fair, Mitch McConnell warned him, "Okay, I'm going to use that too, and that means we'll get people through with a bare majority." So in some ways, Democrats brought this upon themselves by getting rid of the 60 vote rule several years ago.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that always the way it is?
Yeah, and people might have different opinions on that. For some people, a bare majority is enough, and some people think, well, it's kind of a reasonable bar to require 60 votes. I can kind of go either way on that. I see the merits of both arguments.
In my perception of this is that Harry Reid originally got rid of that, and tell me if I'm completely off base, but I think that Harry Reid originally got rid of that because the Democrats didn't want to actually negotiate and compromise with Republicans to be able to appoint judges. And maybe if they had just stopped and looked at the bigger picture and had actually worked to bring some, at least like some Republicans over onto their team, they wouldn't have needed to get rid of that. Am I wrong?
Well, you're correct, but I will push back because I feel like with recent events, it can sound like I'm being harder on Democrats than I am on Republicans. But I feel like this is a case where it should be remembered that Republicans were stalling on all sorts of Obama's judicial appointments,
Hmm.
and they were basically putting up roadblocks to all sorts of judicial nominees, and that is partly where the motivation came from to lower the bar of for judicial appointments. So this problem is owned by both parties.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So they're both equally stubborn when they want their way.
Oh, of course, yeah, equally stubborn, equally hypocritical. Yeah.
All right. So now I want to get into the next topic. But before we do, guys, I just want to do another quick pause. Remind you that if you're enjoying this conversation, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. This is James's second time on the channel. I'm sure he will be back many more times because I just enjoy talking to him. So why not? So please hit subscribe if you haven't already. Turn on those notifications. All right. So Trump is probably going to get his third Supreme Court justice, and what the Democrats are talking about now is stacking the court. So,
Yeah.
can you explain to us what is going on with this idea?
Horrible idea. Absolutely dreadful, dreadful idea that I think a lot of people thought wouldn't come back. Stacking the court, I'm hearing it called stacking the court. It was called packing the court for the longest time, but more recently people are saying stacking the court. Regardless, this was an idea by FDR in the 1930s when, like I said earlier, the Supreme Court wasn't passing a lot of his New Deal legislation. And so he said, fine, I'm just going to start making increase the number of justices on the bench. And by doing so, I'll suddenly have enough justices who agree with me and we'll start ruling that this legislation is constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was, and this happens a lot between the executive and legislative branches and the judiciary, is that something like that is simply presented and the Supreme Court hedges and they start making decisions that are a little bit more agreeable. And then that, in that case, that got FDR to back off and he ended up not trying to pack the court. But historically, just across the board, people over time came to understand that that was an awful remedy, that was an awful idea for a solution. And it's somewhat surprising. I began to be concerned about it. If you remember the early presidential debates from a year ago, Democratic nominees started talking about this again.
Yeah. Pete
And it
Buttigieg started
really,
talking about it, I think. Yeah.
yeah, it really bothered me. And so I'm not exactly surprised that they're talking about it again under the circumstances, but it's a terrible, terrible idea because, again, they're looking at the Supreme Court as though it's a democratic body. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, oh, your party's in power, and so you should have a 60% majority on the Supreme Court. No, that's not how it's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm. So is the idea of stacking the court that they're just like, okay, well, let's live in the fantasy land where Biden wins the election for just a moment, that horrible fantasy land that I don't even really want to think about. But Biden gets in and says, okay, well, I hate that Trump got 3 Supreme Court nominees, so I'm just going to put like 5 more people on the Supreme Court. Is that basically what we're talking about?
Yes. Yeah. And the problem with that is, where then does it end?
Yeah.
How soon is it going to be that we have a 50-member Supreme Court, bench? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's completely absurd.
Well, and the other thing too is, like, let's just say Trump wins for a second. Like, it's not as though it's a secret that the Democrats have been talking about stacking the Supreme Court or packing the court, whichever one. So why wouldn't the Republicans just come in and like preemptively say, all right, Democrats, we're going to outdo you. We're going to put all our people on the Supreme Court. And then maybe a Democrat wins, after, inevitably sometime in the future, I'm sure another Democrat will win at some point. And they say, aha, we see your stacking of the court and we raise your stacking of the court. And it just keeps going back and forth ad nauseum forever.
Yeah. Well, and then the court will have no meaning at all, because it will be a third house of the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who wants that?
What would happen? What would happen? I mean, that almost seems like the Cold War, right? It seems like you've got 5 nukes, so I'm going to make sure I have 10 nukes, and then that's kind of like what it is. Like, what happens if we were like to vision this for a second? What would happen to our society if the Supreme Court ended up being a little mini version of the Cold War between the 2 political parties? Do you think?
Well, I feel like this issue gets right to the point that I'm always talking about, because I can be kind of vocally critical of democracy. And that's not because I'm against democracy, but it's a function that has sort of a limited parameter of legitimacy. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, by packing the court in either direction, and if one does it, the other will do it. That's just bound to happen. But what's going to happen is that the reason why judicial review, the reason why the Supreme Court has come to be an important voice in our system, is because, save for a constitutional amendment, they are the final word on what the law is. We need a body that has that power, because we need to be able to rely on our laws. If our laws are sort of up for whatever the majority sees fit at the time, that's not law. It becomes fleeting, and we become a banana republic, is what happens. The rule of law needs to be stable, needs to be reliable, and that means there's going to be decisions that people don't like sometimes. And if something is especially egregious, let's use probably the worst Supreme Court decision of all time, Dred Scott, which basically established slavery as a right, which just unbelievably awful. And this decision that said not just the state, but the federal government cannot stop it. This was a handful of years before the Civil War. Well, it actually wasn't the Civil War itself that got rid of that idea. And it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It was the constitutional amendment process that changed it. So it's not like the Supreme Court is the actual final word. If they do something absolutely especially egregious, we can still change it. But barring something absolutely terrible, we need something that, generally speaking, provides the last word of what the law is, so that we can have a society that is stable. If we pack the court, we won't have that.
Do you see a reality anytime in our near future where the Constitution is amended?
No, but I think that this would be a really good candidate. It's the threat of packing the court is that there's nothing in the Constitution keeping both parties from doing it. So if we can have a bipartisan movement that says, let's have a constitutional amendment that preserves the 9-member court and that no sort of fleeting politics can change that. I think that would be a very useful amendment.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any possibility of that happening?
No, I don't think there's much possibility of any amendment happening, but that would be a legitimate one in my view.
Yeah.